We've taken a pretty hard look at Hyper-V so far and what it has to offer, and quite frankly, probably most people except the most hardened VMware fans seem to be quite impressed with Microsoft's Hyper-V offering. Now, the biggest complaint though with any of Microsoft's previous versions of virtual machine software has been management tools. Or rather, the lack of any good management tools, and that's definitely where VMware has been one up on Microsoft. Now, depending on who you speak to or what benchmarks you look at, some are going to show that VMware's faster, others show that Hyper-V is faster, but at the end of the day, both companies produce some pretty good virtualization software. There's not a heap of difference between the two really, as the majority of the features are to be found in both products. So, unless you have a really specific feature that forces you to choose one over the other, it's probably going to come down to one of two things: price or management tools. Now, we've already talked about price in other videos, but management tools, that's another story. So that's why we're here now. We're looking at a product called Microsoft System Center Virtual Machine Manager 2008. Now, this Virtual Machine Manager product, quite frankly, I think these are the management tools that we should have had with Hyper-V anyway, but I suppose that's Microsoft's right to try and upsell on us. But what we're going to do in this video is we're going to install the product, we're going to install Virtual Machine Manager 2008, and over this video and the next video, we're going to run through what it has to offer, and at the end of the day, you can decide if you're going to put it on your list of desired bits of software. So firstly though, we are going to take a look at the hardware and the software requirements that you'll need to meet in order to install System Center Virtual Machine Manager 2008. Okay, well, I've opened up Internet Explorer and I've navigated to Microsoft's site here, /System Center Virtual Machine Manager ENUS System Requirements. And if we scroll across, you can see it just ends in the extension .aspx. And if you point your browser to this website, you're going to see that there's a few different components that make up Virtual Machine Manager. Now, this is rather a long page here, so let's just scroll down. So from the top here, we've got the requirements for installing Virtual Machine Manager on a single computer, which is really only recommended for smaller deployments. If we scroll further down this page, we've got the requirements for installing the Virtual Machine Manager server itself on this machine only, and then you go and install all the other components on separate machines. And this sort of deployment is the recommended one when you've got a lot of virtual machines you want to manage. And if we scroll down further, we have the requirements for the Administrators Console, which us administrators will use to manage our Virtual Machine Manager servers as well, and we can see the requirements for that. And a little bit further down, we can see that we have the requirements listed for the Virtual Machine Host, which really has nothing to do with the Virtual Machine Manager though. But these specs here are there for your reference as well, and we can see what operating systems support these Virtual Machine Manager components on. Alright, so let's go right up to the top here. It's easier to get to these from the top. And let's assume that we're going to install all of the required Virtual Machine Manager components on a single server, which is exactly what I'm going to do here in my lab, by the way. And it's also probably what I do in production, just as long as it was only a few servers that I was managing. However, I will say that installing all of these components on a domain controller isn't supported by Microsoft, but that's what I'm going to do here, just because I've only got a few machines to work with. Now, it does work, but bear that in mind when you install the product. Microsoft don't support it, and really, you shouldn't be installing applications on your domain controllers anyway. In my lab, that's fine, but in production, install Virtual Machine Manager on its own dedicated server. Okay, so let's scroll down just a little bit here so we can see what the requirements are. Okay, here we can see that from 5 to 10 hosts, that's 5 to 10 host machines, not virtual guest machines, you should have at least a 2 GHz CPU, a 64-bit one, 2 gig of RAM, and around 10 gig of hard disk space. Now, the recommended spec, though, is still a 2 gig CPU, 2 gig of RAM, but 40 gig worth of hard disk space. But if you double up your hosts to 11 to 20 hosts, then Microsoft recommend a 2.8 GHz CPU, 2 gig of RAM, 10 gig worth of hard disk space, but the ideal machine is going to be a dual-core machine with 4 gig of RAM and around 50 gig. Now, as far as software goes, when you install the Virtual Machine Manager, it's going to install all of these bits of software here if you don't already have them installed. And good on Microsoft, I reckon, for including it all, because one thing I really hate is having to go and download a dozen bits of software first just to install something new. Now with this installation routine, all I've had to do is install a 64-bit edition of Windows 2008, and then the installation wizard installs the rest. So good job to Microsoft on that one. So it's going to install the Windows Powershell, the Windows Remote Management Service, the Windows Automated Installation Kit, and IIS 7 with the IIS 6 compatibility. And in fact, this is the only part you'll have to do manually, by the way. That's install IIS. Now finally, if we scroll down, we're going to need a copy of SQL Server. Now a supported edition of SQL Server can be pretty much any full version of SQL Server 2005 with Service Pack 2 or higher, and SQL Server 2008. Now whether you use the 32-bit or the 64-bit editions of these versions of SQL Server, it doesn't matter, and SQL Server 2008 Express Edition is also supported as well. Now one thing I will mention is that if you want to use reporting, then you will need a full copy of SQL Server, as the Express editions don't support reporting in Virtual Machine Manager. Now if we scroll down, our other option here of course is to install our Virtual Machine Manager server component on just a single server, and like I said a moment ago, large enterprises with a lot of hosts are probably going to like this option. Now this involves installing the Virtual Machine Manager server on one box, and then the other components on separate servers. Now in this case, we're still looking at similar hardware, but since the other components are not on this server as well, we'll expect to get some decent performance here, managing anywhere up to 150 hosts. If you want to manage anything over that, then you're looking at needing about 8 gig of memory in your server. So let's scroll down a little bit further and we can see our requirements for our Administrator's Console. This is what we'll use to manage our Virtual Machine Manager server, and for that we're going to require at minimum another 512 meg of RAM and a rather pathetic CPU. But you're probably going to install this on the Virtual Machine Manager server as well, so factor that in when you size up your requirements there. But in a lot of cases the RAM's going to be the deciding factor. But for pretty much any enterprise deployment, you're going to have a dual-core CPU that's a current one. It's going to be around a 2.66 gigahertz or faster anyway. 4 gig of RAM is almost standard, even in notebook computers. So for a server, any cost increase is going to be negligible. So there's really no reason why you can't put together what I'd call an entry-level machine and easily beat these recommended specifications. Okay, well, now that we've just established what our requirements are, let's just go ahead and install the product. So I've already gone ahead and I've put our System Center Virtual Machine Manager 2008 DVD in my drive, and it's going to auto run like you see here. So let's fire it up by hitting enter, and this will load up the splash screen here, where underneath this setup heading we'll need to select the first link, the VMM server hyperlink, and it's going to begin copying the files it needs to our server to get the installation going. Okay, well our wizard's started, so firstly you can see we'll need to accept the terms of the license agreement, and then we'll click next. Now we can choose here to use Microsoft Update to keep Virtual Machine Manager up to date if we like. Chances are though, if you're running a large enough shop to want to use Virtual Machine Manager 2008, you're probably going to have a Windows Software Update Services server running anyway, and you'll probably leave that in control of your updates. So I'm going to say no here, that I won't use Microsoft Update, but the choice is yours. Certainly, in a production environment, I'd want to ensure that updates are available, so if you aren't using a Windows Software Update Services server, then sure, by all means, leave the top button checked. For my lab though, we're going to say no, and we'll click next. Now, are you willing to participate in the collection of anonymous information about your computer? Nope. Then we'll click next. Alright, now we need to enter in our name and company details. Hopefully you guys don't have any trouble with that. I'm just going to enter in trainer here, and we'll just ignore the company. We'll click next. And the installation wizard's going to quickly check to see that we meet both the hardware and software requirements for Virtual Machine Manager 2008. Alright, now it does tell me here that my machine doesn't meet the recommended amount of memory, and that's fine. Look, I do have 1 gig of RAM on this machine, but it just simply means that our performance might suffer a little bit. However, we're working in a lab here, so that's fine. Again, we've talked about what those recommended hardware and software requirements are. So if this was a production machine, I'd be shooting for a minimum of 2 gig of RAM here. So we'll just click next. We'll ignore that warning. Now I'm going to accept the default location for our installation at Program Files, Microsoft System Center Virtual Machine Manager 2008, and why Microsoft choose to have any of their System Center programs use such long names is beyond me, but they do. We'll accept that default. We'll click Next. Now here we'll need to set up our database. Now we could choose to use an existing supported version of SQL Server, or we can install SQL Server 2005 Express Edition as part of this wizard. Now I'm going to go with the top option here and install the Express Edition, but you could easily use a supported version of SQL Server, and we've already talked about that earlier in this video. So I'm going to use the top option and have the wizard install it for us. I'll leave the default path here and click Next. Alright, here we'll need to specify a default share for our Virtual Machine Manager library. Now this library is a central repository for all the virtual objects, which includes things like hardware profiles, guest operating system profiles, disk images and ISO images. Now the main thing to realize here is that once you set this share name, you can't change it. So don't blindly rush in and click Next and don't even give it a second thought. Now that said, this is a lab, and I'm okay with the name, and throughout this video you're going to see where this name comes into play, and that'll give you a little bit more basis for deciding whether you keep this name or establish your own naming convention. So I'm going to leave the default here to create a new library share with the default name here, and we'll click Next. Now our final step here is to determine what ports Virtual Machine Manager 2008 will use and what account the service account should use. So our Virtual Machine Manager is going to use port 8100 to communicate with the Virtual Machine Manager server, port 80 for agent connections, and port 443 to transfer files to the agents. Now do take note down the bottom of this screen here, it does tell us that the wizard will also attempt to add in a firewall exception for each of those ports that you specify above, so that'll be taken care of for you. Now it's also going to default to using the local system account for the VMM service account, but you can certainly change these values if you need to. Now we're just going to go with the defaults. We'll click Next. We'll get our summary, and if everything looks good here, we'll click Install, and then the installation will begin. Now, since there's a fair bit of software needed to be installed here, this is going to take a while, so we're going to pause the video here, and we'll come back shortly. Alright, well our installation is complete, and over here you can see we've got a lot of green ticks, which is a pleasing sign. Now I'm going to uncheck this box though, because I don't really need to go and check for any updates for my lab here, so I'll just click Close. Now, the good news is that Virtual Machine Manager is installed, but probably the most confusing part is that if we go and click on Start, and we'll go and take a look on our Start menu here, if we look in the All Programs section, there's no reference to it at all. In fact, we did just install the Virtual Machine Manager, but in order to actually load and connect to it, we need to install the Virtual Machine Manager Administrators Console. Now it's this Administrators Console that we'll need to manage the Virtual Machine Manager application. And this of course can be installed pretty much anywhere, and probably is going to be installed on your local workstation, so you can manage the server remotely. In fact, as long as you have Windows 2003, XP, Vista, presumably Windows 7, and Windows 2008 with the latest service packs, you can install this Administrators Console. So back here on our splash screen, we'll click the second item here, the VMM Administrator Console hyperlink, and again that's going to start up an installation wizard. As is standard for most Microsoft applications, the first thing we'll need to do is accept the license terms, so we'll do that and we'll click Next. Like before, we're recommended to use Microsoft Update. Again, I'm going to say no for this lab. In production, of course, you might want to rethink that, or use your local Windows Software Update Services server. Let's click Next. Now we'll get a message here about our Customer Experience Improvement Program, and this tells us that if we choose to enable this feature when we installed the server component, then this Administrators Console would be automatically enrolled in that program as well. So there's nothing to do here, just be aware of that behavior, but you can turn it off later if you like anyway. So we'll just click Next. The installation wizard will check that we meet both the hardware and the software requirements for our Administrator Console, and we're good, there's no errors or warnings. We can continue by clicking Next. So where would we like to install this console? I'm going to leave the default path here of Program Files, Microsoft System Center Virtual Machine Manager 2008, and that's going to take around 512 meg of space, which is fine, and we'll click Next. We're going to talk to the server on port 8100, and we already saw that in the earlier wizard when we installed the server. Just be aware that if you change that port, then you might need to change it here as well. So we're going to go with the defaults and click Next. There's our summary, so we'll click Install. And as before, since there's a little bit of software here that needs to be installed, this is going to take a while, so we're going to pause the video here and we'll be back in a moment. Alright, we're done. We'll uncheck this box here because I don't really want to check for updates in my lab, but I'm going to leave this other box down here checked to add a shortcut to the administrator's console on my desktop, and then we're done. So we'll click Close. Okay, now the next component that we'll want to install is the Virtual Machine Manager Self-Service Portal. But before we can do that, we'll need to install IIS. So we'll go over to our Server Management Console and we'll choose Add Roles. Down here we'll select a web server and we'll click Next. We've got our Introduction to IIS here, which you can read at a later time if that interests you. We'll just click Next. And we'll need to make sure that the following components at minimum are installed when we install IIS. We'll need our static content, default document, directory browsing, and HTTP errors. We'll also need ASP.NET, and that's going to require some more features here, so we'll click our Add Required Role Services button to include those. The .NET extensibility is also required. Now we already have that, so we won't need to do anything there. We're going to need our extensions and filters. Now we'll scroll down a little bit further. We will also need request filtering. Now we'll also need to add in the IIS Management Console in the IIS 6 section, and we'll need to click the Add Required Role Services there. And that'll automatically add in the Metabase compatibility, and we'll also need the WMI compatibility as well. Alright, so that's what we require at minimum there. If you need anything else to be installed there, you can opt to install those things if you like. We'll just go and click Next, and then we'll click Install. Now, as you'd expect, we're going to have to pause the video here again to save you from infinite boredom watching this blue progress bar. So once it's done, we'll be back. Alright, now IIS is installed, so we'll click Close. And we can also close our Server Manager console. And we'll go back here to our Virtual Machine Manager splash screen, and we'll click on the next option to install the Virtual Machine Manager Self-Service Portal. And that'll fire up the next wizard, where our first step is, of course, to agree and accept the terms of the license agreement, which we'll do. We'll click Next. I'm not going to use Microsoft Update for obvious reasons. We'll click Next. Now the wizard is going to do a quick hardware and software requirements check again. And obviously we've passed both of those things here, so we'll click Next. I'm going to accept the default path here, and we've seen this path being used a couple of times now, so we'll click Next. Now here we'll need to tell the wizard where our Virtual Machine Manager server is, and don't forget it could be on a separate server. In my case it's this one here, ladc.jorkus.com. I'm going to leave the TCP port that we're going to communicate on at the default of 8100 and the portal port of 80. But if I click Next right now, then we're going to get an error here, since we've already got a default website using this port 80. So we've got two choices. We could use a host header to differentiate between sites. That way we could keep both of them, or we could just delete the default website. Either's going to work fine. So let's just click Next here, and there you can see that error. So we'll click OK, and personally I'm in favor of deleting the default site. So let's go and open up our IIS console. Now I'm going to expand our server here, then I'll expand sites, and I'm going to right click on our default website and we'll choose Remove. Are we sure? Yes we are. Okay, now let's minimize this and we'll go back here to our installation wizard and we'll click Next. And there you go, the error's gone. So there's our summary. If everything looks good, we'll click Install. And as usual, we'll pause the video here and we'll return once it's done. Well, our installation was successful. We've got green ticks ahoy there, so we're going to uncheck this box here to check for updates. And do take note of this link here, by the way, which you can visit, which has tips on making your Virtual Machine Manager self-service site more secure. So you can take a look at that if you like. All right, well, now we're done, so we'll click Close. And in fact, since we have it open, if we go back here to our IIS Manager and we refresh this and expand sites, you'll see that we now have this Microsoft System Center Virtual Machine Manager 2008 self-service portal. Try saying that 3 times really quickly. But at least that's a good sign that everything's working fine. Alright, well, the final thing that we have to do here on our splash screen is to have a look at the local agent. Now this is an agent that we'll need to install on our Hyper-V server or our Hyper-V servers so that we can manage them from our centrally located Virtual Machine Manager server. So we have 2 ways of getting this service on our Hyper-V server. We could install it manually, that's one way, or we could do it directly from our Virtual Machine Manager server itself. So let's quickly drop down to our desktop here, and we're going to log in to our Virtual Machine Manager using the Administrator's Console. I just want to make sure that we don't have any Hyper-V servers already there. Well, actually, I know we're not going to have any Hyper-V servers configured there, but I just wanted to point that out so you can see that there's no trickery going on here. Okay, well, double-clicking on our icon on our desktop, firstly it's going to ask us what server we want to connect to and on what port. So we're going to connect to this server, localhost, on this port 8100, so the default here is correct, and we'll click Connect. Alright, well, we're in, and the first thing you're going to notice when we fire up this console is that I wasn't lying, we don't have any virtual host, or in other words, we've got no servers, no Hyper-V servers that we're currently managing. So what we'll need to do in order to manage any Hyper-V servers and bring those into this console is to install that local agent component on our Hyper-V servers themselves. Now I've just switched over to another machine I've got in my network. This one is our Hyper-V machine that we've been using in these videos. So this is where we'll need to install that local agent on this Hyper-V server and on any other Hyper-V server that we want to manage with Virtual Machine Manager 2008. So what we're going to do first is we'll consider the manual installation option, and you'll understand why in a moment. So I've just put the Virtual Machine Manager DVD in the drive on my Hyper-V server here, and here's the splash screen that we've been seeing before. So we're going to click the local agent hyperlink, and that's going to start up the installation wizard. There it is. Welcome to the wizard. Thank you very much. We'll click Next. We'll accept the terms of the license agreement. This agent will default to being installed in the Programs file folder in a place called Microsoft System Center Virtual Machine Manager 2008, and that's the same folder all of our other installation wizards defaulted to, so at least it's consistent. We'll leave that default, we'll click Next. What ports will we be talking to on our agent connections? That'll be port 80 and port 443 to transfer files to the agents. Again, these are the defaults, so we'll stick with those. We'll click Next. Are we on a perimeter network? No, we're not, and this is really the reason why you'd want to do this manual installation. Now, if you've got a server that doesn't exist as part of your domain, but you want to manage it, using this option will place a security file in this folder here, which we'd obviously then have to copy over to the Virtual Machine Manager server. Now, obviously in this case, we don't need to do that. So what we'll do is we'll just click Next, and then we can click Install. Now, I'm not going to click Install here since there is another way of installing the agent. I really only wanted to show you how to install the agent manually, since you'll need to do that if you want to install and manage perimeter hosts. So instead, I've switched back to our Virtual Machine Manager server, and over here on the right in our Actions pane, we're going to click on Add Host. And this will start up the Add Host wizard. And we're going to use this wizard to install that same agent on our Hyper-V server. But since it's part of our domain, we'll do it remotely without having to resort to any of these silly manual installations. So from here, we can choose to connect to a host in our Active Directory domain, a host in our perimeter network, and that'll require the security file we talked about a moment ago, or we can connect to a VMware ESX server as well. So we're going to go with the top one, the Active Directory domain, and we'll use the administrator account for our jawkus.com domain. So I'm going to enter in the password for that account, and we'll click Next. Now we'll need to enter in the name of the host we want to add into this computer name field. Now the name of my host is simply called Hyper-V, and we'll click Search, and then we'll click Search once more, and there we can see it's found our Hyper-V server, so we'll select that, we'll click Add, and then we'll click OK. Now we can add in more hosts if we like, but we'll just click Next, and we'll get a message here telling us that since one or more servers we've added to the list is running Windows 2008, that if they don't even have Hyper-V installed on them yet, then this wizard will add that role for them. That's good to know, but it's fine for me. It won't change anything here because Hyper-V is already on that machine, so I'm just going to say, yes, I want to continue. Now we'll need to choose what host group we want to add this host to. Now I'm going to leave the default here at all hosts. Now also note that if this host we're adding was being managed by a different virtual machine manager server, we'll want to check this box here to reassociate that host with this server. Now that doesn't apply to us though, we'll just click Next. Okay, now here we're able to add one or more virtual machine paths, which are simply paths to folders where the virtual machine manager server can store files for virtual machines that are deployed on the hosts. So I'm going to enter in a path of c:\VM and we'll click Add. Now what this is going to do, if it wasn't already clear to you, is whenever we're sitting here inside our Virtual Machine Manager Administrators console and we want to go and create a new virtual machine on our remote Hyper-V server, wherever that server lives in the world, it's going to go and create that inside this VM folder on the C drive of that Hyper-V server. Now the gotcha here though is that we will need to manually create that folder though on our destination Hyper-V server before we're able to create virtual machines on that remote server from this console. Something worth keeping in the back of your mind there. Now right at the bottom we can also see our remote connection port here of 2179, and that's fine. We'll just click Next. Alright, we're done. So we can click on Add Host, and what this machine is going to do is remotely install the agent on the Hyper-V machine and add it as a host, which we'll then be able to manage using our Virtual Machine Manager server. Okay, well it's looking good. We can see that the job status here is moving along, so it appears that something good's happening and our local agent is being remotely installed fine. Alright, and thanks to the magic of television and my pause button, my installation happened in record time. Now yours will probably take a little bit longer than mine appeared to take, but you probably won't even have time to make a cup of coffee. It's a pretty quick installation. Alright, well there's our Hyper-V server, which looks like it needs some attention, presumably because there's a patch available which I haven't yet downloaded. And in fact, right down the bottom here, we can see it does tell us that there is some updates available, so that's very likely to be the problem right there. Alright, well in this video, you've seen how to install and use System Center Virtual Machine Manager 2008 to manage your Hyper-V virtual machines. Now, if you're running a lot of virtual machines spread over many different servers, then you'll probably want to take a look at this product, as it does make managing your virtual machines from a remote central location so much easier. So we hope you've enjoyed this video and would like to thank you for watching.